Mr. Quilty.
Thank you, President. My question is for the Minister representing the Premier. On New Year's Eve, you announced a snap closure of the border, throwing tens of thousands of Victorian lives into chaos for no tangible benefits. But it seems the government learns nothing from its mistakes, perhaps because you're incapable of admitting you've made mistakes. On Friday, you announced a snap lockdown of the whole state because of a handful of cases escaping quarantine. The variant of the virus is apparently wicked, intelligent, moving at hyperspeed, and we can't possibly forget hyper-infectious. We've seen little scientific evidence for these extreme claims. You've done hyper-infectious to death. Where do you go next time you need to stoke fear in the minds of the public? We've had enough hyperbole and enough government overreach to cover up failures. New South Wales has shown us how contact tracing works, but because you have no faith in Victorian contact tracers, we're all locked up. Again. Premier, given you're only allowed to use these powers in a way that's proportionate and the least restrictive of rights of Victorians, how can you justify locking down Victoria for a handful of cases?
Leader of the Government.
Thank you, President, and Mr. Quilty's question.
Thank you. A Leader of the Government on her feet, please. I want to listen to her answer. Thank you.
Thank you, President. And Mr. Quilty's question, as directed to the Premier, obviously covered a lot of issues that we've all been confronting with throughout the pandemic, and the decisions that the government has made has always been based on health advice. I certainly acknowledge.
Get the government to release the advice.
Done? Thank you. Leader.
And Mr. Quilty, I certainly acknowledge the impact that restrictions have on Victorians, particularly acknowledge in your part of the world the border closures from both New South Wales Government, then the advice for us to close our border to New South Wales, and indeed working on bubble arrangements and the like was really important to try and lessen the impact on the daily lives of people that work and live in that area of the region. As I can confirm, the hard-working health officials that provide advice to the government got us through the second lockdown. Mr. Quilty's listening. As you know, we're in a 5-day circuit breaker. We know that this is certainly an impost on communities, particularly those that have not had cases and have not had these restrictions placed on them before. We'll continue to follow the health advice in any decisions that we make in the next couple of days.
Thank you. Before I ask Mr. Quilty to ask his supplementary, I mean, this is unbelievable. I ask members, please, Mr. Quilty asked a question he deserves, and he got time to answer, and he needs to concentrate on the answer so he can ask a supplementary. Unfortunately, from both sides, no one is helping the leader or the person who asked the question. So please, before I ask Mr. Quilty, please, Mr. Quilty on the supplementary.
Thank you, President, and I thank the Minister for the response. It's good to get an actual response in the chamber, even though I couldn't hear very much of it, and you probably touched on some of the bits that I'm going to go in my supplementary, but anyway. As a result of the lockdown, from a handful of cases, businesses have been shut across the state. Restaurants fully prepped for Valentine's Day were left with fridges full of food. They have no clarity for reopening this week either. Schools closed, education disrupted again, including on both sides of the border, as teachers and students from Victoria are unable to attend New South Wales schools. Sports tournaments were cancelled, basketball in Bendigo, tennis in Swan Hill, which is ironic given tennis is essential apparently. We've been told you've only locked down regional Victoria to prevent Melbourne people travelling to the regions because you're unable to enforce the lockdown in the city. In almost all of regional Victoria, we have had no COVID and have never had COVID, with a much lower risk of infection in smaller towns. If we ever do get a case, it'll be much easier to contain and eliminate. Premier, how on earth can the lockdown of all of regional Victoria be proportionate and the least restrictive of our rights?
Thank you, Leader of the Government.
President, I thank Mr Quilty for his supplementary question, and indeed there are important issues that he raised, and I did touch on them in my substantive answer about acknowledging the impact on country Victoria, in particular those areas that have not had cases for some time, particularly small country towns as you've identified. The decision to enforce or bring in a circuit breaker for 5 days based on health advice applied to the whole state because it's only 5 days. If the Premier is on record that if the health advice had to bring in restrictions for a longer period, we would have been in a position to consider potentially different settings as we have in the past. And I know that the 5 days is harsh on all Victorians and country Victorians in particular, and we will inform our next decisions based on the health advice in coming days.